Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones Season 7 review. In this video, I'll give my overall review of Season 7 of Game of Thrones as a whole. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to the end of Season 7. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So a couple years ago, after Season 4 had finished airing, I made a video about my predictions for the pacing of the rest of the series, as at that time it was commonly believed that there would only be 7 seasons in total. In fact, many would state this as if it were a fact, but in actual fact, it had not been at all confirmed, and it was just a number that Dan and Dave were just throwing around. In my video, I stated that I felt the possibility of aliens landing on Earth and declaring themselves to the public was more likely than the possibility that we'd only get 7 seasons of Game of Thrones. My purpose for stating that was that the pacing of the show would not allow it, as it was paced for a longer story. So I predicted 9 or 10 seasons, or at the very least, 8. My reasonings were that this is the amount of seasons needed to keep a consistent pace and end the story properly. I also stated that if there were only 7 seasons, that the ending would feel incredibly rushed, and it would overall feel like a disconnected show with an inconsistent pace and rushed ending. Fast forward to several years later, we learned that I was correct, that we would be getting more than 7 seasons, as it was announced there would be 8 seasons. But there was a caveat to that. The final 2 seasons would be shorter seasons. Rather than the typical 10 episode per season, Season 7 would have 7 episodes, and Season 8 would have only 6 episodes. So although there would technically be 8 seasons, the final 2 seasons combined would have only 13 episodes, which is only 3 more episodes than the typical season. So someone more cynical could look on the show as having 7 seasons, with the last season being slightly extended. In fact, I have heard some people refer to the season that just aired as the first half of Season 7, and the season that has yet to air as the second half of Season 7, but that technically and officially is not the case, as it's not like Breaking Bad or Battlestar Galactica or Vikings, where there's a large break in the middle of a season, but they consider it all one season with 2 halves, as all the official release information refers to this as 2 separate seasons, and indeed it was in fact made that way, as Season 8 is rumored to not even have scripts written for it by the time that Season 7 aired. And so in no way whatsoever are these 2 halves of the same season. They are by all definitions 2 separate seasons. So that's the way that I will treat them, as I would argue that's the way they should be treated. However, let's get back to my concerns that the ending would be incredibly rushed if they ended it in only 7 seasons, because even though there will be definitively 8 seasons, the last 2 are shortened. So when I heard this, I was a bit concerned that they would not be allowing themselves enough time to end the story properly. However, the showrunners had assured us in interviews that they had a plan to end the series, and they only needed 13 more episodes to tell the ending of the story. So I took them at their word, because they have earned my trust by pulling off the almost impossible job of managing to adapt a series of rich and complex novels that many had deemed unadaptable to the visual medium. And not only did they manage to adapt them, they did an amazing job at doing it, and so created one of the best TV shows ever made. Sure, they had a few blunders here and there and a few adaptations that didn't quite work, but on the other hand, they had actually improved upon the novels in several cases, and overall rightfully changed a few things to better fit the visual medium. Therefore, when they said they could tell the rest of the story in 13 episodes without it feeling rushed, I took them at their word. However, there was another factor gnawing at the back of my mind, and it is in fact something that many have noted how incredibly tired and exhausted the showrunners David Benioff and Dan Weiss look at times, be it interviews, behind the scene featurettes, or whatever. Over the years, they're starting to look more and more exhausted. Now, some may say this is just mine and others' interpretations. However, they themselves would often talk about how making this show was arguably the most expensive show in TV history, which is filmed across multiple countries, relying on huge, unprecedented casts and very extensive sets and special effects, and coordinated action sequences, was incredibly exhausting. They would also talk about how little time they get to spend with their families while they were making the show, and they were looking forward to a much-deserved break once the show is finished. And in fact, I often defended them in this matter, as it's kind of understandable how exhausting all this would be, and you can have sympathy for someone who barely sees his own son through the early years of his life. I remember at Comic-Con panel after season 4 aired, where George R. R. Martin was there. He talked about how he wished there could be more than 10 episodes per season, and Dan and Dave were very obviously not thrilled by this comment, and went on to explain how massive and time-consuming the process of making a mere 10 episodes was. And I defended them on this because this is a cinematic quality that they're pumping out, and a 2.5-hour film is typically made over the course of a year or longer, and they are creating 10 hours of nearly the same quality and scope every year. So I can understand how exhausting that could be. Nevertheless, the concern gnawing at the back of my mind when they announced that they only needed 13 episodes to tell the remaining story was that maybe that wasn't necessarily true. Maybe they their desire to end the show after 8 seasons was more based on a feeling of exhaustion and wanting to see their families again, than rather it being what's best for the story itself. And although it could be told in 13 episodes, that perhaps it couldn't be told properly without feeling incredibly rushed and failing to live up to the quality and writing contained in these 6 previous seasons. And after having watched season 7, I unfortunately have to say that gnawing feeling at the back of my mind was spot on. Now, shortly before season 7 aired, Dan and Dave talked about how these final 2 seasons would have a faster pace than previous seasons, as things were coming to an end. Therefore, time didn't need to be spent on introducing new characters or establishing character traits, and that's fine. In fact, I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. It actually made me more excited for season 7, because all the previous seasons, even though they were good, they did have moments, typically in the mid-season, that did move too slowly and contained what I deemed filler, that is, scenes that added nothing to the characters or overall story and were just there to fill up space. So the thought of a season that moved very quickly without filler and had a swift pace that got straight to the heart of the story sounded very appealing to me, so I had high hopes that season 7 may be the best season yet. But getting to the heart of season 7, the reason why I believe that this is without the doubt the worst season the show has ever produced isn't because I feel the pace was too fast necessarily, or that it felt too rushed, but the issue with season 7 I feel would be better described by having horrible pacing overall and inconsistent pacing. The first 2 episodes of season 7 were actually paced too slowly, particularly for a shortened season. Episode 3 and 4 I felt had the perfect pace that I was expecting season 7 to have, swift and fast that got straight to the point, but not too fast as to sacrifice character stories. But then the last 3 episodes 5, 6, and 7, were all indeed paced far too fast and did feel incredibly rushed and made the show for the first time in its history feel fake, contrived, and unbelievable. So you might wonder, If the purpose of this video is to review Game of Thrones Season 7, why then have I spent so much time discussing pace? And the answer to that is that pacing is important, and in fact the main issue that I had with Season 7, and is quite a huge issue, in fact. Previous to Season 7 airing, my least favorite season of Game of Thrones was Season 3, the reason being because the pacing was off. In that case, the pacing was too slow. No doubt an issue that came about from the showrunner's decision to split Book 3 into 2 seasons, where I believe it would have worked better as one extended season. But Season 3 did happen, and it established a pace for the show overall, along with the other seasons of having a long arc that takes time to set up each story and revel in the character moments. And in that way, the events occurring on screen weren't simply characters moving from place to place or doing things, getting into battles or whatever. The characters felt real and dynamic, and you identified with them, understood their motivations, and the events that occurred made sense, and they took place in a well-established world with its own history and lore and a set of rules that were strictly adhered to. But quite frankly, the last 3 episodes of Season 7 did not feel that way. Other than a few nice character interactions, the overall plot of these 3 episodes felt like people just moving from place to place and a series of events occurring with no greater meaning or intent behind it. Something I've heard many people say is, this plane is coming in for a landing and there's no time to slow down. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I get that we don't need more characters' introductions, nor do we need a scene with Lady Olenna discussing her bowel movements with Tyrion. But just because the show is ending, it absolutely, positively is no excuse to leave out character building scenes and scenes necessary for world building and that expand upon what's happening in the story. In fact, I would argue because the show is ending, it makes these scenes all the more necessary. The idea that any show coming to an end needs to rush to its ending is an absurd one. All one needs to do is look at Breaking Bad and the slow pace that it had for its brilliant final season to see the absurdity in that comment. We spent 6 seasons seeing Daenerys grow from a young exiled girl sold off to a warlord to a powerful queen who freed an entire people from slavery, won the devotion of the base of the most feared warriors in Essos, gained access to another powerful army of former slaves that she freed, and acquired 3 large and fearsome dragons, a creature many believed no longer existed. We spent 6 seasons seeing Jon Snow, who started as a bastard with no name or respect, make a name for himself in the Night's Watch and eventually rise to become king in the North. We spent 6 seasons watching Arya turn into a wild, loudmouth girl into one of the world's deadliest assassins. We spent 6 seasons watching Sansa grow from naive, a young girl believing in fairy tale life, to a wise and deceitful and fair leader, and so on and so on. In these final 2 seasons, we were meant to finally get the payoff to these extremely long setups, and then to just rush through them with no care is not a satisfying payoff at all, and in fact simply makes the show come off as all set up with little payoff. And in that regard, it reminds me a lot of the show Lost, which set up many, many mysteries and character stories, but did a horrible job in paying them off at the end in a satisfying manner. The bottom line is that this season should have been 10 episodes, not 7, 10. And I know I've said this before, but I cannot stress this point enough. For the season, if the season had 10 episodes, the first 4 episodes of the season could remain more or less the same. Maybe a few tweaks here and there, taking out a few scenes, adding in a few more, maybe make episode 4 longer, as there's no excuse for a 52-minute long episode in a season that only has 7 episodes. But with the final 3 episodes, what is currently episodes 5, 6, and 7, these episodes could have easily been doubled. And yes, I know episodes 6 and 7 were longer in runtime than most episodes, and so go ahead and actually keep that run length for the final 2 episodes of the season. Episodes 5, 6, and 7 move so unbelievably fast without much payoff. They should have been doubled in time. Getting into some specifics now, let me talk about episode 1, Dragonstone. Watching episode 1 now, it's completely unforgivable how many slow-paced or altogether unnecessary scenes there were in this episode when you look at how unbelievably rushed the last 3 episodes of the season were. It's a complete and utter misuse of time and pacing. Episode 1 comes off as a typical slow-paced setup season opener that all previous seasons had, and for the penultimate season that intended to have a much faster pace and get to the point, that's completely unforgivable. So the episode starts with Arya using Walder's face to kill all the Freys, and this was an amazing scene. The problem, however, comes in the lack of follow-up. It was unclear what happened to the Riverlands after the slaughter of the Freys, not just the Riverlands, but the twins, and for that matter, what happens to the twins with the Freys dead. It's perceivable to see that the Tullys could easily take back Riverrun, and all the houses in Riverlands would be more loyal to the Tullys than any other house. For that matter, Edmure, in fact, should have been followed up on. In season 6, Jaime promised to take him and his family to Castle Rock. However, that promise clearly wasn't fulfilled because in the season 6 finale, Walder Frey states that Edmure is being held in a dungeon at the Twins. So it would have been nice getting a scene with Arya freeing him and encouraging the Tullys to retake the Riverlands. But instead of getting any scenes like that, we got a scene with Arya running into some Lannister soldiers. Now, at first, I praised this scene, saying that this was a nice learning curve for Arya, seeing how Lannister soldiers are people too, and also having her enjoy some warm company by the fire. But in retrospect, seeing how ridiculously sped through the final 3 episodes of the season war, it's hard for me to look on this scene as anything more than an excuse to have an Ed Sheeran cameo. When talking about the scene, it does sound like the scene was specifically designed so Ed Sheeran could have a cameo. And so this is what Season 7 boils down to. Vital storytelling moments are sacrificed so that pop stars can have cameos. Another scene in Episode 1 that was unforgivable is the scene that was far too long of the Hound traveling with the Brotherhood without banners. Now, I do think this scene was really powerful, as it showed how much the Hound had changed and foreshadowed events to come. But did it really need to be this long? Maybe if there were 10 episodes this season, it would be okay. But in a 7-episode season, this is totally unacceptable. In fact, I believe the Hound and the Brotherhood should have appeared more in this season. But how necessary was it to get follow-up on the farmer and his daughter that Arya and the Hound ran into in season 4? Not necessary at all. Seemed like pointless nostalgia to me. And also in this episode, the Sam storyline throughout the entire season seemed unnecessarily slow. But again, this wouldn't have been too much of an issue had this season had 10 episodes. But all that being said, more time should have been spent establishing that Cersei knows about the threat that Daenerys is posing. We should have seen on screen her learning about this threat and coming to terms with it. But in fact, the very first scene of the season we get with her, she and Jaime, just very quickly just spout the exposition, just spit it out very casually and just talk about it. And it's not like Daenerys appeared out of nowhere, which she did. Overall, I felt robbed of a lot of good moments that we should have had. So more time needed to be spent on this. And we only get one brief scene of Bran at Castle Black with Dolorous Ed. One very brief appearance by him this season, where we needed to see much more of their interactions before suddenly just showing up at Winterfell out of nowhere. Episode 2, Stormborn, actually more or less could have been left alone. It actually featured a lot of necessary character building scenes and exposition scenes that were necessary in setting the stage for the rest of the season. It was amazing getting Daenerys meet with her allies, particularly Lady Olenna. We needed to see that, as we needed to see Cersei meeting with the Tyrell Bannermen to try to gain their support. And seeing Arya reunited with Nymeria, who then runs off, was absolutely amazing and added so much to her character. And of course, the Ironborn ship battle at the end of the episode was absolutely amazing. However, there's still a few changes needed in this episode. First of all, there was a scene that was totally, absolutely unforgivable that it took up so much time in a season that was so rushed. And even in a 10-episode season, I think this scene could have been cut like to a quarter of the time that it took up. And I am, of course, talking about the Grey Worm and Missandei's sex scene. I mean, seriously, is there anyone out there that actually cares about this story? I'm sure there are 2 or 3 people out there, but really, this scene, as it stands, is completely unacceptable. Grey Worm barely appears in the season after this scene, and Missandei is really nothing more than a glorified secretary after this scene. Don't get me wrong, I like these characters, and I like the character building scenes even for minor, underused characters, but again, compared to how lightning fast the last 3 episodes of the season move, and compared to this scene, is simply unforgivable. And then there's how incredibly rushed the storyline with Jorah getting his grayscale cured was. Now, I don't have any specific examples on what they could have done to fix this, but surely if they had more episodes, they would have had time to tell this story properly. So then there was episode 3, The Queen's Justice. And this episode actually, for the most part, was fine. I know some people complained about the scene with the Unsullied conquering Castle Rock, while Tyrion was giving exposition. I actually loved how this was pulled off. And some people complained about how quickly Highgarden was taking, but I'm fine with them fast-forwarding through that too. Previous seasons have proven that we don't need to see every battle, and some can occur off-screen, such as Jaime's defeat and capture by Robb Stark at the Whispering Wood. And to show this battle in any detail, I feel would be kind of gratuitous. The only thing I would say, though, is better explanation on how an attack on a castle that was highly fortified like Highgarden was able to happen so quickly without a prolonged siege. I mean, you don't even need to show the battle to do this. Just have a quick line of dialogue that explains this. And the explanation they attempted to give about the Tyrell soldiers not being great fighters is unacceptable. Since Tyrell bannermen were involved in this battle, this problem could have been solved with a simple line of dialogue saying they used a little-known method to break through the castle, much like Tyrion did to get Castle Rock, or perhaps they had siege weapons they knew would be successful, effective against the walls, and knew exactly where to attack. So it's a problem that could be fixed in like less than 30 seconds. And then this episode also features one of the things that bothered me most about the season, the very sloppy and hastily way that Mira Reed was just written off the show. It was so obvious to the writers. I mean, the writers could have just popped up on screen and said, hi audience, we actually have no idea what to do with Mira, so we're just going to get rid of her. I mean, that's essentially what the scene was. It made no sense. They should have taken more time. If they wanted to write her off, do it in a way that fits the story, that feels natural. They should have taken more time to do that. So then there's episode 4, The Spoils of War, which is by far my favorite episode of the season and may be in my top 10 favorite episodes of the entire show, or at the very least my top 20. The battle sequence in this episode was amazing and very satisfying. One of the best, if not the best, battle sequence ever done in the show. However, that being said, this episode suffered from some pacing issues too. As great as the battle was, there should have been more setup to it and some things made more clear, particularly how they got the gold to King's Landing so quick, just how many Lannister were in the army that got destroyed in this attack. I don't need like an exact figure, like it was 20,206, but just a general idea. Was it like half of the Lannister forces? Was it more than half? Was it less than half? Are the Lannister forces irreparably damaged because of this? Is this like a drop in a bucket? Just something. And why in the hell is Daenerys burning the food? She said earlier in the episode itself that she needed the food to feed the Dothraki, and for that matter, the food is desperately needed to feed all of the people of Westeros. She just condemned hundreds of people to die a slow death of starvation, and no one's talking about this. This again would have been fixed by a simple line of dialogue indicating that it wasn't all the food that was destroyed, it was just like a couple of wagons, and that the wagon train actually stretched on for miles, and then that could be followed up with Daenerys indicating what she plans to do with the rest of the food. For an episode called Spoils of War, they were actually rather vague on what happened to these spoils of war. And in addition, we get another truly unnecessary scene with Arya showing up at Winterfell and the guards not believing who she is. Not only is this scene unbelievable, it was just a tired rehash of something that we'd already seen. It didn't need to be there, and it certainly did not need to take that long. Okay, so now we get to the heart of the matter, Episode 5, Eastwatch. Originally, we were told it was called The Blood of the Dragon, but then all of a sudden it was changed to Eastwatch, which barely appears in this episode, but whatever. So this episode could have been stretched to 2 episodes easily, possibly even 3. A lot of things happened in this episode so fast it felt extremely fake and forced. Where to begin? Well, the scene with Daenerys burning the Tarleys for not bending the knee was actually really good, but it should have been followed up with a lot more scenes. A lot. As I said, it should have been made clear how defeated the Lannisters were and how many men went to Daenerys' side. And the biggest blunder of all is that Daenerys simply went back to Dragonstone to sit on her ass and do nothing, and all of a sudden seemed more concerned about fighting the White Walkers than defeating Cersei, which made no sense whatsoever. We later learn that Daenerys has controlled the 7 kingdoms, as in the final episode Cersei talks about taking back the lands from Daenerys. So when did she ever take these lands in the first place? We needed scenes with Daenerys like flying to the other kingdoms on her dragon and gaining their support. Last season, we were told Jon and Sansa were touring the north to try to gain support to take on the Boltons. We didn't see them at all of their stops, but we saw like 3 token stops to showcase the kind of response that they encountered. Like some were positive, some were lukewarm, some were negative. Something similar could have been done with Daenerys, showing her go to like 3 different houses and demand that they bend the knee, and when one refuses, she burns it down, and then another agree. In fact, they could have a token house that fully supports full tent because they hate the Lannisters, so no threats required. I think the Riverlands would be a great place for that. And again, we should have gotten some follow-up on what happened to the Tullys. It seems like they would have made great allies for Daenerys, which she was in short supply of at this time. And for that matter, we should have gotten something, anything, even if it was just a random line of dialogue here and there to indicate what happened to Dorne, the Reach, and the Stormlands, and for that matter, a mention of the Vale in regard to Jon Snow would have been nice as well. And perhaps they could have been another off-screen battle with the Lannisters to show that Daenerys has truly defeated them. And there should have been some word of Grey Worm and his Unsullied, who were last seen trapped at Castle Rock, but then all of a sudden just appeared at King's Landing in Episode 7. How'd they get there? I don't know. Which way did they go? Did they secure more castles in the Westerlands? Or did they make some friends in the Riverlands? Something would have been nice. And of course, there's also the matter of how Jaime made it all the way back to King's Landing in a few scenes without being captured or seen. And then there's Jorah, who turns up at Dragonstone and is finally at long last reunited with his beloved Khaleesi, his beloved Queen Daenerys, and 2 seconds later volunteers for a mission to go away from her as far away as possible, where he'll probably die. And she doesn't even seem all that interested in this mission in the first place. So, what? This made no sense whatsoever. We needed way more scenes with Jorah reaccumulating with Daenerys and a much better explanation as to why he'd volunteer. And for that matter, I mean, they should have had Jorah with Daenerys and seeing their character interactions for a good full episode before he leaves again. And for that matter, why is Daenerys all of a sudden willing to put the conquest of King's Landing on hold in order to get proof of the White Walkers exist? Just because Jon showed her some cave drawings? I'm sorry, we needed way more build up to this. And for that matter, Tyrion Tyrion's whole plan is stupid. They should have come up with a much better reason for them wanting to go north of the wall, and why at this stage not just kill Cersei. I know Daenerys doesn't want to kill thousands of innocent people at King's Landing. She doesn't want to get a bad reputation, but there are several ways that she could accomplish this. Right up to the Red Keep, roast her alive, or even better, right up to the Red Keep and threaten to roast everyone in there alive unless they turn over Cersei. Do you really think that these cowards who months earlier were just throwing shit at her and looked down their nose at her until she committed an act of terrorism wouldn't just throw her out in the instant? Just here, take her. Of course they would have. But instead, Tyrion suggests that they go on a suicide mission so they can attempt to make a truce with someone whom they know will never honor such a truce. A much better explanation should have been put forward on why Cersei isn't dead yet, because the one that they used felt very fake, very contrived way to keep Cersei alive when it didn't make sense to do so. And let's get to the hastily thrown together fellowship. The introduction to the storyline was one of the most rushed, nonsensical, and unbelievable that the show has ever done. First, let's tackle Gendry's introduction back into the show after a 4-year absence. Just out of nowhere, Davos decides to look him up so he can take him to be a smith in Winterfell. Why? Who knows? And then Gendry all of a sudden wants to go on a mission he knows nothing about, to fight an enemy he knows nothing about, with people he knows nothing about. This makes absolutely positively no sense whatsoever. Way more time needed to be spent setting up Gendry and making his inclusion to the Fellowship make sense. Also, more time needed to be spent on the Hound and Beric and Thoros, how they got to the wall, what the hell happened to the rest of the Brotherhood. It would have been nice to see them show up at Winterfell, for example, on their way. It's hard to believe they could make it all the way to the wall without stopping for food and supplies, and Winterfell would be one of the best places to stop. And for that matter, why are they in a jail cell at Eastwatch? They never really explained this. It would have been nice to see them arrive and see their interactions with Tormund, and we should have gotten more of their introduction to the Fellowship rather than just a silly scene when everyone's in a jail cell just being dicks to one another for no good reason. Also, it should have been made clear that there was more than just 7 people going north of the wall, and the couple of red shirts were going with them. In fact, there should have been way more people going with them, like a whole troop, not just a couple of red shirts. So next, let's get to episode 6, Beyond the Wall, which up until after this episode first aired, I thought was called Death is the Enemy, right up until the reviews for this episode started coming out and calling it Beyond the Wall. And just by the way, Death is the Enemy is a much, much better title. Just FYI. So anyway, the problems with this episode had more to do with the logistics than it did pacing. But there's a few pacing issues that could have been corrected. The episode featured a lot of great character interactions between the various Fellowship members. However, this would have been more believable had the build-up to the storyline not been so rushed and made a lot more sense. And with all the character interactions we got, we were missing an important one. That is one with Jon Snow and the Hound. The Hound, after all, used to serve the Lannisters when they were at war with his family, and he was present when Ned Stark was executed. He has a long relationship with both of Jon's sisters. So you think they'd have a couple of words, and it would have been nice if Jon questioned why is he here, and asking him how committed he actually is, and it would help flesh this character out more, and it would just be great to see that interaction. But more than that, we needed more on this mission for it to make any kind of sense, because at the moment it just felt rushed and hastily put together, and it ended up not nowhere near packing the punch that Hardhome did. and it looks kind of childish in comparison. The whole thing should have been handled differently, as there's a lot of logistical issues and the passage of time and why they were going in different directions than they should have been going. And of course, Daenerys' arrival should have been handled way better. Setup for it should have been done and made it make a lot more sense, so it didn't come off as a contrived Deus Ex Machina, like, you know, having her be at Eastwatch on standby. And speaking of contrived Deus Ex Machinas, Benjen should have been introduced into the Fellowship way earlier, and more time should have been spent with his character. Maybe instead of him just instantly dying for no good reason, he could have taken Jon off somewhere and they reminisced, but then they got cornered and he was in an actual position where he needed to sacrifice himself to save Jon. Because as it stands, his inclusion in this episode was absolutely horrible writing, some of the worst the show has ever done, and more needed to be done to establish the Night King, as the fact that he was able to take down a dragon so easily and seemed so prepared for it made no sense whatsoever and felt incredibly contrived. Yes, I know people will say he's a greensayer, but that's pure speculation because we have not seen this in the show at all. This is what I mean by it seeming like a series of events that just happen with no rhyme or reason. For that matter, Bran should have played a way bigger role in the season. He barely appeared at all, and he wasn't at all helpful. If he can see things everywhere, we needed a lot more scenes with him, tracking the White Walkers, helping out Jon and the others. And now let's talk about Winterfell. Because we needed to see way more of this storyline to make it believable. We're expected to believe that Littlefinger's ultimate plan is to get Sansa to kill her own sister and to get Arya to threaten to kill her own sister just because of a letter she wrote as a little girl while she was under duress. That makes all the characters involved come off as idiots. So finally we get to the season finale, episode 7, The Dragon and the Wolf. And despite the fact that this was an extra long episode, it could have easily benefited from being 2 episodes. Now, all the stuff at the start of King's Landing featured some great character interactions with some amazing acting, but it was marred by the fact that they shouldn't have been there in the first place, because they simply should have just killed Cersei. So they were all being a bunch of morons for thinking that to be able to get her to stand down while they fight the White Walkers. Instead, they should have just simply killed her and took King's Landing. But if you want to let that one slide, then at the very least, Daenerys shouldn't have been letting Cersei dictate the meeting. Instead of being so worried that Cersei might refuse the deal, she should have been like, oh, fine, don't take the deal. I'll just kill you then. In fact, the whole meeting should have been Daenerys offering Cersei an ultimatum, not a truce. After all, it's been well established that Daenerys has the clear advantage over Cersei, and if Daenerys decided to attack Cersei, she'd be screwed. So she should have pressed that advantage because, she should have pressed that advantage. But, and it's already been established that this was her backup plan, and she should have simply pressed that backup plan instead of acting like it was the end of the world if Cersei didn't agree to this truce. That just gave her the advantage which she didn't need to have. And for that matter, she should have some backup plan and insurances to ensure that Cersei keeps her end of the bargain even if she agrees to it. As they should know that even if she agreed to it, she'd probably be lying. You know what? Screw all that. Just kill her. So the fact that they didn't just kill her from the very beginning of the season, when they should have, comes off as nothing more as a contrived and artificial way to keep Cersei in the story, which can only be described as bad writing. Anyway, so let's touch on this Jon and Daenerys romance. As it stands, this is all tell and no show. Throughout the whole season, other than when they touched hands kind of briefly in the cave, we didn't really show us any romance between these two. Well, I mean, there was that scene when they were in the boat after Eastwatch battle, but that was towards the end. We got a lot of telling snide remarks from Davos talking about how he saw Jon staring at her good heart, and snide remarks from Tyrion indicating that Jon was looking at her romantically. But I'm sorry, that's not enough. This romance felt out of the blue and forced, and so they could have taken more time to set this up properly, which would have been helped by more episodes. When Jon went to her room for a booty call, I literally laughed out loud because it was not at all earned nor believable. They went from Daenerys treating Jon with hostility and calling him an enemy to them shagging in 4 episodes, and that was way too fast, especially if this is meant to be the romance that they hang the whole end of the series on. Okay, so let's get to Winterfell again. Way too much of the storyline occurred off screen. We went from Arya prancing around like a psychopath threatening to wear Sansa's face, to Sansa being pressured by Littlefinger to kill Arya, which she was actually considering, which is totally out of character, to a big reveal that Arya and Sansa know every bad deed that Littlefinger has ever done because Bran told them, so they're going to execute him. Now, apparently, there was a deleted scene where Sansa went to Bran after Littlefinger convinced her to execute her own sister and wanted to make sure that there wasn't more to it and sort of check the internet for information, as they say. And Bran just laid everything out. And one thing I want to make clear, the inclusion of this deleted scene would not have helped. We needed to see way more. And plus, that still makes absolutely no sense. How could we go from Sansa and Arya wanting to kill each other to them smiling and giving each other high fives? This felt so contrived and not the least tiniest bit earned because it was far too rushed. And I know there's this other theory out there that they say if you can accept without the inclusion of this deleted scene that Arya and Sansa were in it all along, but that theory is actually just as bad as the other one because it makes no sense for them to be putting on such a convincing act when no one else is around to see it. And too much occurred off screen for the purpose of having a big shock when Sansa turns on Littlefinger. If big shocking moments can't be done in a way that's believable to the characters and consistent to the storyline, then they shouldn't be done at all. And getting to Littlefinger, it's not at all believable that he didn't have a backup plan for his eventual failure after he received a warning that something was up with Bran when Bran was able to say his key catchphrase that explains his entire scheming philosophy. And when he was called up at the Winterfell, he should have defended himself more vigorously and more deceptively than simply crying and begging for mercy. He should have called them out for simply taking the word of a creepy weird boy and the fact that they had no real proof, and then he could have spun a series of convincing lies that would have put doubt into people's mind. That is true to Littlefinger's form. But did he do any of this? No. And why is that? Because it's obvious the writers were in a hurry to simply kill him and be done with it. More time needed to be spent on this. And I'm not going to get into the BS with Bran's revelation on Jon Snow's real name because this simply shouldn't have been done at all, and no amount of time spent on this would have made it better. And pretty much the same thing with the whole Dragon White taking down the wall thing. Although I can't imagine a scenario where it wasn't as cringy as it was if more time was spent on setting up for that scenario. But yeah. So yes, in short, the season should have been 10 episodes. These last 3 episodes should have been 6. Then they would have had more time to actually do these stories justice. However, pacing may have been the biggest issue I had with Season 7, but it was not the only one. There were several other issues I had with Season 7. First, let me tackle fan service. Now, before I give any specific examples of fan service, let me first define what I mean by fan service, because there's a misnomer phrase going around that doesn't actually address the concerns of fan service and misunderstands what is meant when somebody says fan service. And this phrase is I'm actually guilty of using this phrase as well. I've said it before, and this phrase is, I'm a fan and I felt service. Now, I shouldn't have used this phrase because it doesn't address what is actually meant by fan service, as fan service is a phrase that means things that are done simply to please the fans, and they do not add anything to the story nor the characters, and is often out of place and does not fit into the story and is often out of character. And these concerns are often tossed aside for cheap shot at appeasing the fans at the expense of good storytelling. When I used the phrase I was a fan and I was service, I was referring specifically to the scene where Arya trained with Brienne at Winterfell, as some accused the scene of being fan service because it was something that the fans wanted to see. However, I would argue it was not fan service because despite it being something the fans wanted to see, it actually enhanced the story and it stayed true to the characters. As it made sense, Brienne admired Arya for being a strong fighter, and it showed that Arya now had respect for Brienne for beating the Hound and didn't hold any grudges against her, which is consistent with both their characters, and it builds some new interesting character dynamics between them. Further, the fact that Sansa and Littlefinger see this exchange helps push the story forward, as it gives Sansa and Littlefinger the knowledge on just how dangerous Arya is. So that isn't fan service, as it was actually very effective and true to the characters. However, one of the season's biggest sins is that it is filled with shameless fan service that detract rather than add to the story. The biggest offender of this fan service to me is the White Dragon. By extension, the White Dragon bringing down the wall with blue flame. In my opinion, this is far and away by a million miles the worst example of fan service the show has ever done. So much so that I feel the show may never recover from it, as fans have been crying out for an ice dragon, so the writers obliged them and gave them one. And on top of that, hey, it's cool, it spits blue fire and it brings the wall down. I'm sorry, but that's something like a 10-year-old would write. Yay, dragon white, pew pew, rah rah. Not something I expect to see in a complex fantasy show like this one. Further, it wasn't at all earned, nor consistent with the characters, nor the world established, and all it does is cheapen the overall storytelling in the show. But other than that, the next worst example is the Jon and Daenerys romance. As I mentioned before, this was not at all earned, as it's been done. It just comes off as fan service. As these are two of the biggest fan favorites of the show, and fans have been fantasizing about these two hooking up for years, so the hastily way in which it was executed comes off as a cheap way to service the fans at the expense of the story. And then there's Gendry, who just seems to pop up out of nowhere and serve no real purpose. It seems the only reason he was introduced was to appease fans. In fact, the Inside the Episode feature at Dan Day pretty much admit that this is the case, as they say, well, we knew we'd always bring Gendry back because the fans like him and they want to see him again. So it wasn't because he added anything to the story, nor did they find a way to bring him back in a way that felt true to the story or fit with where they were going. He seemed like a last-minute add-on that served no true purpose other than fans going, wow, Gendry! They even went as far as to add a line of dialogue that alluded to a long-term joke and meme that Gendry had been rowing for the past 4 years. I would have much preferred they found a way that stayed true to the story to bring him back, or don't bring him back at all. And the death of the Sand Snakes was pure fan service, although I will admit the way it was executed actually fit with the story and made sense, because as I said, I really enjoyed the sea battle. But it can't be denied that ever since Season 5, when the Sand Snakes received negative reaction, the show went out of their way to either ignore or insult them, so having them just killed off in the most brutal ways possible was another shameless way to appease the fans. However, the death of Peter Baelish wasn't so well earned, which makes it even worse fan service, as fans never liked that guy and thought he was creepy, so they rushed to kill him off and didn't take the time to make his death as meaningful and epic as the character deserved, so another bad example of fan service. Now, Clegane Bowl has been something the fans have been crying out for many years, so some might praise the season for not giving in to Clegane Bowl, which would have been obvious fan service. However, although they didn't give us Clegane Bowl, we got the trailer for Clegane Bowl when the Hound went up to the mountain and said, "Oh, you know who's coming for you, brother. Oh yeah." Does he? How does he know this? Did the Hound make a vow years ago to kill him? No. So what the hell is he talking about? This moment was a very telegraphed use of fan service so all the fans could get hype, get hype, get hype. But who cares if it actually, makes sense for the story? And there are many other examples of fan service in the season as well, but I feel these are the worst and the main ones worth mentioning. But overall, the season had way more fan service than any other season has. These examples soil the season and make it come off as sloppy writing, that the writers are no longer interested in telling a great story and more interested in making the money. So now, let me talk a bit about Deus Ex Machina. This is something that means God in the machine, which refers to a device used in Greek theater where the gods would just, appear out of nowhere and save everyone. It's the most commonly nowadays is used as a phrase that describes a cheap way to save characters from peril when the writers have written themselves into a corner and can't come up with a believable way to save characters, and thus to use a contrived device that doesn't actually make sense for the story and wasn't really set up for at all. Now, there are examples of Deus Ex Machinas in earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, from Tywin and Tyrell showing up at the last minute to save Tyrion and Cersei, and when the Battle of Blackwater to Brienne stepping in at the last minute to save Sansa and Theon from the bolted soldiers, to the Vale army showing up at the last minute to win the Battle of Bastards. However, I dare say the use of Deus Ex Machina was much worse this season. For one thing, the fact that it was shamelessly used twice within 10 minutes is pretty goddamn unacceptable. First, when Daenerys showed up with her dragons to save Jon and the others from the White Walkers. Now, granted, this was somewhat set up for because we knew Daenerys and her dragons were on their way, but the fact that they managed to show up at the exact moment that they were needed when coming from a great distance is really ridiculous. Not to mention the fact that it was just so telegraphed. It felt more fake and contrived than anything that was done in previous seasons. But shortly after that, they pulled an even worse Deus Ex Machina when Benjen just, pops up out of nowhere and saves Jon, by the way, who should have never been put in danger in the first place, as he should have just simply got on the dragon. And then Benjen had no setup whatsoever. He simply just appears out of nowhere and goes, "Hello," and then promptly dies for no good reason. Even though there are examples in the earlier seasons of Deus Ex Machina, there are many examples of them not being used when TV shows would have typically used them, such as at the end of the first season when Ned Stark was executed. Being new to the show and used to typical TV tropes, I had expected a Deus Ex Machina to come and save Ned at the last minute, but to my surprise, none came. And during the Red Wedding in Season 3, when the Starks were being slaughtered, I expected a Deus Ex Machina to step in and save Robb and Catelyn, but none came and they died. The show in the past has always been good at subverting the audience's expectation. Everyone expected the righteous Red Viper of Dorne to defeat the evil Mountain and save fan favorite Tyrion, but out of nowhere the Mountain grabs him and gouges his freaking eyes out. That is Game of Thrones, and has always been Game of Thrones. That is up until now, as these days are apparently long gone, because now we know if one of our heroes is in danger, don't worry, they'll be saved by Deus Ex Machina. Which leads me to my next point, plot armor. Now, to be fair, this problem kind of started in Season 6 when Arya was viciously stabbed and should have died and instead was able to run marathons shortly after. But the problem got even worse this season, as typically a lot of characters die. As much as the Arya plot armor thing was ridiculous in Season 6, Season 6 still had the guts to kill over 20 characters, including fan favorites like Marjorie and Loras Tyrell. Whereas in Season 7, we got the least amount of deaths we ever had in any season. We got the deaths of the Sand Snakes, Lady Olenna, Thoros of Myr, Benjen Stark, Viserion the Dragon, and Littlefinger. So that's 8 characters? That's if you count the dragon as a character. And all these deaths, with perhaps the exception of Lady Olenna and Thoros of Myr, who was a minor character no one really cared about, he barely appeared in the show. The rest of the examples were fan service. The Sand Snakes and Peter Baelish were fan service because no one liked him. Benjen was fan service because people just wanted to see him used, so they just pop him in there to do a Deus Ex Machina and then die. Viserion was fan service so they could get an ice dragon. Oh, there's also Randall Tarley and Dickon Tarley, so 10 characters died. But Randall, again, is a character that everyone hated. He thought he's a dick to Sam, so it's fan service to kill him. And Dickon is a character who barely appeared, so nobody really cares if he dies. Any fan favorites or important characters seem to be protected by several layers of thick plot armor. Jaime can fall in the river and sink to the bottom in heavy water, weighted by his armor, right beside a fire-breathing dragon that wants to kill him, but then suddenly just emerge from the water miles away where he just was and be perfectly fine. Jon Snow can emerge from a frozen lake in the Arctic and make a journey for miles on a horse and not die of hypothermia. Tormund can be dragged down by whites, an act that instantly killed a bunch of red shirts and yet managed to survive and be saved by the Hound. And the producers have confirmed that Beric Dondarrion Tormund survived the collapse of the wall, which should have killed them both. So, in a show where any characters could die at any moment, a show that in fact became famous for the very reason that it killed off a lot of its main characters and fan favorites, no matter how popular they were, time and time again, has devolved into a show where the only deaths are done to appease fans. And any fan favorites the fans don't want to die are protected by layers of plot armor, regardless of how contrived it is. So finally, let me address the teleporter. Now, this is something fans have been complaining about for years, and particularly it got really bad in Season 6, and this refers to the inconsistencies and how long it takes characters to travel long distances. Now, there are many strawman arguments that try to defend this practice, which I addressed in other videos, so I won't be addressing it here. But the teleporter complaint was more present in Season 7 than ever before. However, for most of the season, it didn't bother me personally, and I didn't complain about it because, frankly, I thought the worst example of this was seen in the Season 6 finale when Varys was shown traveling the vast distance between Dorne and Meereen in a matter of seconds. However, that was until Episode 6 this year, where the most inconsistent use of the teleporter was used when they managed to get a raven from Eastwatch to Dragonstone, and then Daenerys flew on her dragons from Dragonstone to north of the wall in a time frame where Jon and the others hadn't died from hypothermia after being left in the open in cold Arctic in the middle of freaking winter. And that was simply one of the most absurd things I've ever seen. And all season, there were inconsistency in travel times. It was extremely noticeable where even the common casual viewer was complaining about it. It no longer became a case that only the nitpicky book purists were complaining about it, as many claimed. It was now very apparent that's something that everyone, down to the casual viewer who hardly watches the show, was complaining about, and only the most staunch fanboy tried to defend this practice. However, I have seen an argument pop up, not just in defense of the teleporter, but in all of the logical inconsistencies and flaws in logic in Season 7. And this argument, frankly, makes me sad. It makes me sad that trained and educated critics are making this argument. And whenever they do, I instantly lose all respect for them. And that's the argument, hey man, it's fantasy, don't worry about it. One critic, when asked how fast the dragon flies, answered, well, the same speed as a unicorn or a leprechaun. This makes me facepalm very hard, as this is fundamentally, it misunderstands how fantasy works. It's fantasy writing 101. It's a basic tenet of fantasy writing. It's such a simple and basic rule. Any critic who makes this argument, I believe, should not be allowed to review fantasy works anymore. At the very least, shouldn't be listened to when reviewing fantasy works. As the basic rule of fantasy is set up rules for your fantasy world and stick to them. You can't just have anything happen out of the blue, damn logic, and then go, well, hey man, it's fantasy. That's not how fantasy works. For example, in Lord of the Rings Return of the King, you couldn't have Aragorn just shoot laser beams from his eyes and grow wings with no explanation, as it's never been established that anything like that could happen. That would break the basic rules of fantasy, and thus would be just as absurd if in the Shawshank Redemption, Andy Dufresne grew wings and flew out of the prison. Just because it's a fantasy doesn't mean anything goes. It means this world is operating on a different set of rules, but it needs to establish and stick to those rules. And in Game of Thrones, ravens were not established to go at the speed of light. People are not established to survive Arctic conditions in the middle of winters for an extended amount of time without freezing to death. And yes, even resurrected people like Jon Snow have not been established to survive this. Has clearly been established that Beric Dondarrion can still be killed by anything that kills anyone. So my rating for Game of Thrones Season 7 out of 10 is a 5 average. I had previously given every season of Game of Thrones a 9 or a 10, with the exception of Season 3, which got a 7. And this one is lower, so yes, I am saying this is easily the worst season of Game of Thrones. The first 4 episodes of the season were good, and episode 4 may be one of my favorite episodes of the entire show. But the last 3 episodes were so horribly written, sloppily executed, I believe they may have damaged the show beyond repair, to the point I believe there is no hope for Season 8. So for the first time in my life, I find myself not anticipating the next season of Game of Thrones. And that, I believe, earns the rating to be dropped to at least a 5, regardless of how good the first 4 episodes are. And even then, the first 4 episodes are not without faults and are guilty of some of the flaws you see in the later episodes. But I can't drop the rating lower than the 5 because it still contained amazing acting, amazing cinematography, maybe the best battle sequence the show has ever done, and yes, even a lot of great writing in certain scenes. But it simply doesn't work when judging the season as a whole. So that's it for my review of Game of Thrones Season 7. Be sure to check out my live discussion on Season 7 as a whole with other special guests. I'll put a link in the description below for that video. I'll also be doing a video for various lists of top 10s of my favorite and least favorite aspects of Season 7. And we'll try to do the occasional Game of Thrones video during the break, as well as I covered many other shows like Star Trek and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.